Welcome back to YouTube's greatest MGS5 long-form analysis series. In this entry, we'll be diving into the events of the mission Angel with Broken Wings. Along the way, we'll have to discuss a lot of key themes and ideas imported from the real world. In some ways in this episode, we'll be putting into practice a kind of philology, which is a word for the study of the tree of life like family history of words. We'll look at Old Testament stories, like the one with Elijah and Ahab, Ishmael, and the last book of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, as well as discussing the tangled strands of the origins of ancient words like Moloch and Malak. Along the way, we'll also discuss a monotheistic tradition that became so taboo, history could not bear to record it, namely child sacrifice in ancient. But our purpose here is not to denigrate any one group or scapegoat anybody. Our purpose here is to excavate some of the origins of Western culture of monotheism relative to, vis-a-vis, MGS5. Not to zero in on one group at the expense of any others, or imply anything anti-Semitic. If you are an anti-Semite, I don't mean an anti-Zionist, but somebody who is an anti-Semite. If that's you, close my video and don't watch my content, because you don't have the compassion or the intelligence to understand what I'm saying. By the end, we'll begin to discuss what will become in future episodes a major fixation, the subjects lurking at the bottom of MGS5, yet always there, hiding in plain sight, namely hypnosis, mind control, and the suggestible logic of the unconscious, the power of language, the power of words. Metal Gear Solid is the Information Age series. And MGSV is the pinnacle of this concept. We will see this repeatedly while discussing the game, especially in terms of the Phantom Pain's many references to names and events from the Old Testament, or the Bible. But before I bore you with a bunch more of this big picture stuff, how about we cover everything that happens in this mission in the Phantom Pain, just on a basic level, before covering the more video essay stuff any further. So, the basics of Mission 10, Angel with Broken Wings, are as follows. Diamond Dogs is sent in behind Soviet lines on a rescue mission. We're sent in to save the Pashto-speaking Mujahideen named Malak, who is the sole survivor of a recent attack on an Afghan village by the Soviets. What we're told initially is that we've been given this contract by Malak's father, as his father's dying wish. Which subconsciously might echo something that Liquid Snake says in MGS1. But this idea that we're sent by Malak's father as his dying wish gets contradicted by Malak himself. Eventually we find out supposedly the story behind the story, that Cypher has sent us here, that they're trying to get their hands on Malak for some strange reason, and that they were trying to use us as their carrier boy. So after saving Malak, Kaz tells the client, Cypher, that Malak died in action, and yet our clients give Diamond Dogs the full payout anyway. Pretty strange. Well, underneath the surface, this is the biggest story mission since Where Did the Bees Sleep? But to understand it fully, you have to complete the bonus objective, which requires tailing Malak's escort unit.
Понял. Как вы называли дешмана?
Я совсем недавно был в его деревне.
До того, как ее сожгли.
Нет, сразу после. Огонь еще не утих.
Деревню же разбомбили, а?
Нет, не было этого запаха.
Запаха?
Напалма. Все здания еще стояли.
То есть это был обычный пожар?
Знаешь, что там произошло? Говорят, что выжить не удалось никому.
Всех убили? Что за черт?
Что на деревню на самом деле напал горящий человек.
Горящий человек?
В последнее время слухи стали совсем странными. Она затянулась, все малость тронулись умом. И себя тоже береги.
Спасибо за помощь.
Будь начеку. Какой же с него ангел, если Бог дал его деревне сгореть, а?
Going off the clues that we're provided in this mission, I think it's fairly clear that Skullface is the one who has really sent us here. Just as it was probably Skullface who arranged for Mission 6, Where the Bees Sleep, like we covered in the last entry in this series. Malak's village was hit with what must have been the man on fire prior to any scorched earth operation. The village burned down prior to the airstrike, leaving no telltale scent of gasoline before the attack, according to one of the Soviets that we hear the driver discuss Moloch with en route. What I'm saying is the village burned down, there was no smell of gasoline, then an airstrike happened. Given this, and also given what's hinted at the end of the mission, it seems fairly clear that the man on fire must have been used on Malak's village, and then afterwards, the Soviet Scorched Earth campaign was used as a cover story. An actual attack by the Soviet military did take place to cover up the use of the man on fire, and this is the second time that the Scorched Earth campaign in Afghanistan has been used in this way. Remember, it was supposedly rumors of a Scorched Earth campaign in the area that first scared the Tajiks out of Dasmaseh Fort before Mission 6, which left the mountain stronghold open for the Hamid fighters to take over, and that was about the time that Skullface, via the CIA, gifted the Hamid with both the honeybee and the Pashto strain of parasite, which kills all of them except for Silent Basilisk, and leaves the honeybee in danger of recovery by the Soviets, or even worse, America's other enemies in the region. So we see a common MO with the Soviet Scorched campaign alibi, a common mode of operating. That's how we might start to recognize Cypher's work when we see it, although we'll complicate this later on in the video. It can be kind of confusing, because Cypher is being split apart, and all the various wings of Cypher operate with a similar MO. They all share a similar way of operating. It makes it sometimes pretty difficult to figure out who is who at what point. And the game intentionally obfuscates this by trying to throw us off the trail, and sometimes it blames Skullface for something that's actually occurred when Skullface and the surviving members of Cypher were simpatico, or in cahoots. He gets sort of scapegoated. You see, Skullface did learn from Major Zero how to conceal sensitive sites. If you remember, Zero did this to keep people away from, for instance, his secret safe house.
Hell's Kitchen, 10th Avenue. He is undergoing treatment there.
Not exactly Hyde Park.
His medical needs keep him from moving around. That is why he summoned me there. The other residents are of varying race and ages, but in reality, all 40 units are Cypher personnel. It took him 10 years to replace the original occupants. He's got places like this all over the world.
No better place to hide a needle than a stack of needles.
Remember, in Peace Walker, rumors of El Basilisco kept the Guerrillas away from Strangelove and Huey's lab. Cypher's descendants and spin-offs and splinter cells like Skullface have inherited the same MO, and this makes sense given how Skullface is basically operating Cypher as one of its head honchos until his English strain plane and his walker gears and things like this, the building of Sahelanthropus, all of these start to make the rest of the group aware of his true intentions. I'm referring here to Dr. Clark and Donald Anderson, who are at this stage in the game, in 1984, the beginning of Phantom Pain, the only living members who are still associated with Cypher. And both of them have largely outsourced the day-to-day operations of running the world to the Patriot AI network as per Zero's will. Capturing Huey alive is the first step for Cypher, using us as their proxy to figure out what Skullface has really been doing in his little havens in places like Afghanistan and the Angola-Zaire border region.
Boss, that target you extracted, Malak, is saying that he's never heard of our client. What's more, he says his village was destroyed long before he was ever taken prisoner. Apparently it fell victim to some sort of disease, then was completely burned to the ground. Malak was out on a mission at the time, and that's the reason why he alone survived. But the question is, who hired us to find him? According to Malak, he saw strange soldiers snooping around the village when he got back. Turns out they were members of Cypher's Strike Force XOF. My theory is they wanted to get their hands on Malak to question or silence him before the Soviets could get to him. Cypher was just using us to cover things up. All that crap about Malak's relative was a front to convince us to retrieve him. But an entire colony just wiped off the map. It sounds a lot like the Hamid during the Honeybee incident. All I know, boss, is there's no way in hell I'm handing Malak over to Cypher. I decided to bring him back to Mother Base instead. He's one of us now. We told the client through a cutout that the target was killed. For some reason, though, they still paid us everything we were owed. Cypher's obviously up to something, and this is probably just another preemptive cleanup operation to them. But to Malak, he lost his village, his family, everything, and he wants his revenge. In other words, he's one of us.
The need-to-know system of compartmentalization, which is integral to spy stories, of course, is on full display here, as ever in Metal Gear Solid. Nobody sees the full picture, because the system in Metal Gear Solid was created by paranoiacs who are terrified of leaks and people putting 2 and 2 together and actually making 4. Even Code Talker thinks, or says he thinks, that Malak's village was hit by the Soviets in a standard scorched earth operation. Like so much else in the game, this is ambiguous. I think Skullface has kept this information from Code Talker genuinely. I think Skullface knows that Code Talker will eventually wind back up in league with the Patriots. So he's very careful what he tells them. Though, as we'll see later on, Code Talker is hardly the most trustworthy person in Metal Gear Solid 5. He plays the character of the naive, innocent scientist well, but there's much more to Code Talker than meets the eye, believe me. Now, when you consider how Skullface's true plan revolves around using the third boy, and consider how the third boy and the Man on Fire are closely tied together, it seems we're being told indirectly that the use of the Man on Fire itself is very much in the need-to-know category for Skullface's true plan. I'm saying the Man on Fire is one of Skullface's secret weapons. So that's why he doesn't want word to spread of the Man on Fire's existence, in the way that by the end of the game, he will want word of Sahelanthropus' existence to spread. He's very careful about controlling information about what he lets get out. The details of Skullface's true plan, from the third boy's psychic amplification powers, to the metallic archaea, the walker gears, Sahelanthropus, and the English strain of vocal cord parasites, all of these things are secrets Skullface keeps Cypher's AI system and us, its angel-like messenger boy, in the dark about. And this is why I find this whole mission completely suspicious. I think that this information that's circulating, that we're hearing rumors about, was leaked on purpose. I think that Moloch is left for us to extract on purpose. I think that the whole situation is designed, essentially, to make us feel like we're one and the same with Malak. There are all these elements to his story, to the things we hear people say and do, that inspires sympathy on an unconscious level for Malak. All of this makes him almost irresistible extraction target. And I think this is what Skullface really wants. So seems to be happening is Skullface is gradually leaving breadcrumbs for us to follow, that we will be following throughout the rest of the game, all the way up until his final mission. But soon enough, we will learn why the Man on Fire was used on the village. Malak's village was the site of the third vocal cord parasite test. Presumably, the Man on Fire was used to ensure that there would be no trace left, no spread of the contagion. The first test took place in Africa, the second in Desmase Fort, and the third in Malak's village. According to Code Talker, Cypher failed to recover a sample of the infected from Malak's village. Could that be because Moloch was the sample, and it was we, Cypher's proxy, who absorbed him into our ranks? Could it be because Skullface engineered the situation where we would recover Moloch? I think that's exactly what happened, and I think we can conclude that pretty definitively because of the appearance of XOF, which is mentioned, and the Man on Fire, who both are Skullface's puppets. They're Skullface's toys, so to speak. The only thing that's really consistent and makes sense is that it was Skullface's wing of Cypher, if you will, that had Malak's village torched twice. The strain that infects Mother Base, of course, won't be the Pastro one, but the Kikongo one. So going by the rules of the parasites as they are relayed to us, this must mean Moloch was never symptomatic, never got sick, because he never passed the parasites on to fellow members of his language group on Mother Base. And notice that Mother Base is this isolated island petri dish for experimentation, much like these isolated pockets in Afghanistan. Frankly, the whole thing with Moloch and this mission, Angel with Broken Wings, is a bit of a mystery. If Moloch wasn't symptomatic, if he wasn't sick, then why did Cypher want to study him? Why did the Soviets want to study him? Could Moloch have been asymptomatic but still a latent carrier of something? It sure seems like Moloch has something potentially wrong with him, that he has, in the words of the novel Heart of Darkness, become scientifically interesting. But whatever the case is, we can say for sure two things here. One, Moloch definitely isn't sick with the vocal cord parasites. We would know loud and clear if he was. And two, weirdly, Cypher seem like they want us to recover Moloch and have him join Diamond Dogs rather than genuinely want us to deliver Moloch over to them. The reason why this is also convoluted is because Skullface and Cypher, as in the Patriots, were working together at one point for a time, but then they split up. And afterwards, the Patriots have tried to rewrite the records to make it seem like Skullface was acting on his own. But the truth is, Skullface had actually convinced the Patriots to do experiments into vocal cord parasites, further experiments. This is the basis, the beginning of the dream that eventually metamorphosizes into the SOP system of nanomachines, which the Patriots will use to extend their global control into people's very hearts and minds. This nanomachine technology seems to be predicated based on Code Talker's parasite research. First, there are the parasites, and then they seem to evolve, so to speak, by the events of Metal Gear Solid 1 and so on into things like Foxdie, but also things like the SOP system. And of course, the nanomachines that will dominate the world of Metal Gear Solid by the events of the final game, chronologically, Guns of the Patriots. So that's what makes this so complicated. It really doesn't seem like whoever gave us this mission genuinely cared about getting Moloch back. It seems like what they really wanted was to gift Moloch to us. And I can only speculate that events like these, Trojan horse, golden opportunities, in other words, like these, are what will lead Diamond Dogs, sort of like original sin out of the Garden of Eden, as a research organization further and further into dangerous parasite research territory, which will of course lead to the horrifying events near the end of the game. Moloch may be worthy of study simply by having come into contact with the infected and having not gotten sick. Who knows? But no matter what, there seems to be an implication that Malak, whose heart is sick with revenge, is a form of sick psychologically. That's what makes him, in Miller's words, one of us. He's out for revenge, for blood, and he's a man who's lost his country. So wouldn't you know it, he just happens to fit right in. It's all just a little too damn convenient, too perfect by half. To believe that the goal wasn't to get us to extract Malak and keep him among our ranks all along. The craziest aspect to this mission is what we don't find out unless we follow Malak all the way to the outpost. The Soviets have been doing autopsies on people in the region, both living and dead. They clearly suspect some horrible bioweapon has been unleashed here, and it must be killing people. But what the Soviets don't seem to know is why Malak's village was targeted for an airstrike by their own military. They seem to realize that this has something to do with the pathogen, but they don't seem to know how. So they interrogate Malak over what it is that made his village worth targeting. This proves that Malak's village was not hit in a true standard scorched earth operation, or at the very least that we're seeing here the principle of a need to know compartmentalization type system in action, because for whatever reason they can't ask their own men why the village was targeted. And the Soviets here are sort of like us trying to find the answers to this game. Surely you could find this out if it was a normal situation without interrogating the enemy, but that's just how information poor that the Soviets are in this scenario. And this does track with real life because Afghanistan is such a remote, difficult terrain that getting factual information out of it is very difficult. Now, the Soviets are only transporting Malak to this outpost because they feel they have to interrogate him. It's sort of like when we get to Skullface at the end of the game. There's some crucial information that this person has that can't die with them, that has to be extracted out of them. They have to interrogate Malak as an enemy combatant if they want to learn the truth of the actions of their own forces. And apart from all the thematic undertones that this is striking, this also shows that behind the scenes, most likely, Skullface is pulling the strings of the Soviet military. This is how I came to the conclusion that it's Skullface's wing of Cypher who has sent us on this mission.
Как самочувствие Малака? А мне откуда знать? Врач осмотрит его, когда приедем на место.
Говорят, его отправят на вскрытие.
Вскрытие? Он жив еще.
Говорят, что если тело не повреждено, то вскрывают всех, и мертвых, и живых.
Первый раз слышу. Мне сказали одно — доставить в Яху обувь.
Ага. Только ты это... не говори никому, что это я тебе сказал. Ладно?
Хорошо.
Говорят, что по деревне Малака недавно прошла какая-то странная болезнь.
Болезнь?
Да, и судя по всему, деревня сгорела задолго до бомбежки. А? Кто идет?
Что такое?
Skullface knows about Malak because he's so embedded in the Soviet military apparatus. The irony of all this for Malak is that it seems the reason for the airstrike is a ruse. There is no reason. It's just to cover up the use of the man on fire and the vocal cord parasites. That's why it's so unusual. That's why the Soviets don't understand why their own military seemingly chose this random village to attack with no strategic value. But this isn't something Malak knows, so the interrogation is pointless. As are all of the driver's kind words. Malak doesn't share the same language, so he misinterprets what the man's saying to him. He just assumes that he's denigrating his people. The airstrike was to cover up the Man on Fire's cover-up of the testing of the vocal cord parasites, just to recap. And for whatever reason, Cypher did not, according to Code Talker, get their hands on any trace of the experiment. Again, it's left up to us how to interpret this little aside, like so much else in this game, as a truly revolutionary new form of espionage postmodern fiction. No matter what, though, the whole thing feels extremely dark, a bit like the racist experiments done in Germany and in America. For instance, the Tuskegee experiments. And look it up yourselves so this video can stay monetized. Now, I'm not going to cover in this series all of the secrets that are embedded in the missions or the cutscenes themselves, like how it seems Venom Snake in this mission and in one earlier, Over the Fence, seems to call Mother Base, or Diamond Dogs, the organization, by the name Outer Heaven when talking things over with a new recruit. And he does this. We don't hear him say this, but we can infer because we hear the recruit respond as if it was said. So the implication seems to be that Venom Snake doesn't remember having said it, but that he said it, or something like that. Some sort of memory repression. Little hard to tell. Why this is called Diamond Dogs or Mother Base sometimes, and then Outer Heaven another time. Why there's so many different forms of cipher. All I can say at this stage is it's all just pretty indicative of how strange language works in Phantom Pain in general. Think how we've been discussing how hard it is in general to pin down who exactly is Cypher when Cypher is said at any one time. There's 3 different factions in Cypher all vying for control, locked in a civil war, plus Cypher, by the events of the Phantom Pain, have basically begun to evolve into their next evolutionary stage, the Patriots, which is the AI system that Cypher designed and put the entire world into the palm of according to Zero's will. And this weirdness of language in these games, and the power of Hideo Kojima's use of language and meta-narrative fourth wall breaks, will of course continue to be a major reoccurring theme throughout my videos on MGS5. Alright, so that covers the basics of Angel with Broken Wings. Now we're going to delve into some deeper analysis. Even though this series is using the tapes as the focus, we're not going to hear any discussion of these events that this mission portrays on tape for some time. More or less, we're out of new tapes that are story relevant until we get to the events of Hellbound, not counting the ones we get when we encounter Quiet. So for this entry, we won't actually be discussing any specific tape. Our analysis of the tapes of MGS5 is simply expanding as the series goes on to also involve analysis of some of the words that are being used in MGS5, like Malak, for instance. I do hope someday to double back and finish my series on secrets in the cutscenes of Phantom Pain, as well as do another series on things that are hidden in the missions themselves and communicated through gameplay, but that's way down the road. As far as the weirdness of words in Phantom Pain and why they merit analysis, we've already begun discussing this with names in the Phantom Pain, like Cypher or Outer Heaven. You'll find that the Phantom Pain is very, very selective about its word use. Things often contain or refer to multiplicities in MGS. In MGS5, it's truer than ever. Think about how Fat Man in MGS2, his name derived both from a character from the film Maltese Falcon and one of the bombs that were dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. But speaking of the history of power, that brings us to our next section. Keep in mind here that monotheism is defined by its adherence to sacred texts. Christians, Muslims, and Jews might be referred to collectively as the Brotherhood of the Book. And book, it so happens, in Hebrew, is the word Sefer. This is different from cipher. Cipher originated in Arabic as a term for zero. Both Sefer and cipher, though, arguably anyway, are ideas unconsciously suggested by the name in Metal Gear Solid, Cypher. At least that's one interpretation. Now, the discovery, or perhaps, if you like, invention of the concept of zero, historically began in India and spread throughout the world thanks first to the Arabs in the 8th century, then later thanks to Fibonacci, who brought it to the West in the year 1202. But ciphers, that is to say cryptography, meaning the art of concealing information in the form of meaningless, encoded strings of information, goes back a very long time indeed. You might even say it goes back to the very beginning, literally the beginning of life. Even upon conception, a human's existence itself depends upon encoding, transmitting, and then decoding information in the form of genetic material, what is passed on from one generation to the next. Remember, Metal Gear Solid is the information age game. So you might say a form of cryptography or ciphers are literally in our DNA. And this is something Metal Gear Solid will remind us of multiple times in various ways, of course. Even information warfare itself exists on the microbial scale. Look at the virus, smallpox, for instance. Studying viruses and microorganisms, it so happens, was pivotal to the development of information technology, the birth of the information age. But, as this DNA example indicates, long before the information age, which really got going in the 70s into the 80s, long before then, information was already running our world. We just hadn't yet realized it. According to one perspective, the whole universe is just various forms of information exchange, encoded or enciphered, chemical and physical processes, which inevitably trend and decay back to zero as they converge and change from one form or state to another. Life is the name we give to this finite physiochemical process. And our existence, MGS2 tells us, is just a grace period, a transitionary period from one state to another, one data set to another, a brief chance for us to sustain our lives in the limited form of reproduction, reproducing not only our genes, but our memes, our memories, our ideals, our languages. What I'm saying is that information, up to and including words themselves, is a very powerful force in the world. You might even say information is all there is. Or have we just described all there is? It isn't that everything is literally information, because as Greg Yeager points out for philpapers.org, information is just a language, basically. It's just a tool for describing reality that works really well. That doesn't mean that it is reality itself. As Professor Yeager points out, while detailing how this idea that everything is information actually came out of the Manhattan Project and the quantum revolution that occurred around the Second World War, imagine trying to have H2O, but just the information of H2O and not water. It doesn't really exist, the idea in of itself, because language is just a tool for getting at things metaphorically or indirectly. Now, it's true that wherever there is H2O, you have water, and regardless of what form it's in, you don't have the same binding together with information and content that you have with chemical formula and substance. But I will read a bit from Dr. Yeager's piece on an old interpretation of how reality might be constructed, going back to the physicist John Wheeler from the Manhattan Project era, just to show you how rich and vibrant that the field of interpretation in the hands of real experts can become. Physicist John Wheeler had already begun wrangling with quantum phenomena when he joined the Manhattan Project, where his project colleague John von Neumann worked out the algorithmic theory of classical computers, long before there was any notion of the quantum computer or computer networking. So, side note here, John von Neumann shows up in Metal Gear Solid. You'll remember that the boss is instructed to assassinate him, realizes last minute that it's not a real assignment. She hesitates and then she gets shot. And that's how she winds up in her coma. And we're told this in Peace Walker. Okay, back to Dr. Yeager's piece. But by the end of the 70s, after the first substantial computer network, ARPANET, had been established in 1969, Wheeler had formulated the idea that the universe is a meaning circuit, a system self-synthesized by quantum networking. Wheeler's networking is the communication of data by observers, whom he calls quantum participators, because their observations, which he calls the iron posts of reality, are the basis of further experimentation and scientific theorizing. This meaning circuit is of two sides, one of meaning and information, and another of physics and engineering, and is supposed to give rise progressively to existence itself. Given that knowledge of objects increases with experience, it might appear that Wheeler has done well by having conceived of this meaning circuit. Now I'm going to skip ahead a bit just to give you an idea of how views on this subject have changed, and how this meaning circuit has held up in the 21st century. In our era of the internet and quantum computer research, the meaning circuit world picture may appear plausible, and it might appear even more so if a quantum mechanical internet is established in the future. But the existence generated in the meaning circuit resembles an all-encompassing virtual reality rather than the physical universe, and the meaning circuit idea is abstract, physically vague, and scientifically unsupported. No matter how much human planning and choice may be involved in experimentation, there is no evident process, however long and complex, describable by physical laws and/or cognitive psychology such that the data of the mental world could give rise to the physical world. In physics, if a law does not explain some process either completely or correctly, there must be something wrong with the law or with how it's being applied to the conception of measurement. And according to cognitive psychology, modern cognitive psychology, we obtain knowledge of physical events by becoming aware that they have taken place, however much we may be involved in the design, construction, and carrying out of experiments. Tempting though the idea that information or consciousness itself could create physical events or objects may be, as a means to resolve the measurement problem, the postulation of a novel but physically irreducible mental cause of physical events or objects is not explanatory because it has no empirical basis, end quote. Alright, so what is Dr. Yeager talking about here? Essentially, he's saying that there is a hard line between physics, physical reality, and the world of the mind. Information theory is a very majestic tool for being able to understand, at least on a functional level, aspects of how our reality comes together and fits together and works. Now, words are not the things that they referred to. And this really is what Dr. Yeager was talking about, if you boiled it down. Words are not the thing that they refer to, they are a metaphor, as Nietzsche would put it. Nietzsche also famously said that we know that language and truth are not so closely tied together, and all you have to do to see this is to just lay the different languages down next to each other and compare them, and realize that they're each affirming or expressing a different culture, a different cultural reality. There is no one word for a chair, say, or an apple. There is a multiplicity of different interpretations, and as we get into in Phantom Pain, Kotaker will tell us that language is deeply tied to culture, and that's why the extermination of languages is akin to a kind of, at least this is what Phantom Pain is arguing, at least on some level. And that's why the game gives us the statistic about all the different language groups at the end, and points out that yes, throughout the game it tells us that language groups can go extinct like species. So that speaks to the rich tapestry of language as something that is way more than just a tool for ascertaining the truth. It's a way of expressing a culture, a mindset, a time and place. So as much as information is powerful, it's more than just, it isn't God's language. The prelapsarian language is what this is called in postmodern fiction and postmodern theory, and that just refers to the language that was spoken in the Garden of Eden before the fall of man, when mythologically speaking, man's words did coincide with the things in of themselves. If you're interested in this, I recommend reading Paul Auster's New York trilogy, which was a huge influence on the writing of Metal Gear Solid 2. So hopefully I haven't confused you too bad by going into these various philosophical themes and philosophical ideas. But the reason I bring all this up is, again, to emphasize how much Metal Gear Solid is the information age game. And how we're dealing in Phantom Pain, as we have been since, I would say, at least Metal Gear Solid 2, if not the first one, with the topic of information, the theme of information. And under that is included everything from Western civilization to the canon of older Metal Gear Solid games, to science, classic movies, all these memes, as Metal Gear Solid 2 called them, borrowing Richard Dawkins' term. That's really what Metal Gear Solid as a series is about. It's a clash of cultures, a clash of information systems, a fight over what to call the truth. And that's what makes, of course, the truth tapes at the end so ironic, because that's just the truth that the game is imposing on us at the end, insisting upon a truth that shatters our whole notion of the game and our whole notion of the character Big Boss. And all of this will have to be explored in a later video when we finally get to talking about the subject of mind control and things like that. Wheeler once believed information is all there is. Or have we just described all there is and not really gotten at the essence of it, the substance of it? This is a question that philosophers have debated for eons and will continue to do so, because there's no one answer. Now, classical science and its inherent doctrine of positivism, which is something we'll talk about when we get to that video essay I'm working on about this game and the philosophy of science. That positivism would tell us that there is only one reality, and that it is an objective one, defined by objective Enlightenment era processes, like the basics of what we were just talking about. But the deeper truth of reality, the reality of reality, if you will, if we're talking about as regards human beings, is not so cut and dry. We might call this human reality, a world of information in motion. Thanks to the doctrine of multiple interpretations, there are many different worlds going on in many different heads at any one time. Thanks to the theory of relativity, it's literally possible that there are parallel worlds, parallel selves. According to the idea of linguistic relativism, words are the fundamental units of thought. This is the idea that words literally control us from the inside. Things like this are what led philosophy to drift away from the Enlightenment to what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida might have called texts which produce texts. It's a realization that language, that words, that narratives structure our whole sense of reality. And if there's a real reality out there, we can't necessarily get at it in of itself. We can only access it imperfectly through language. In Orwell's 1984, there's a memorable scene near the end of the novel where a poet named Ampleforth points out that his rhymes are prefigured by the underlying structure of the English language. You can only write new lines of poetry which rhyme in time on a line through minds. Such a crime. You see what I mean? In Silicon Valley, there's a very famous theory about ideas as semi-literal mind viruses. This theory is based on a book, which ironically builds its arguments from an ingenious comparison that it makes between the human mind and computer software. Words, information itself, has a life of its own. And here we can think, of course, of Richard Dawkins and his seminal meme theory, which argued in the 70s that is actually our memes and genes, all of our information. In other words, not we wider creature objects we call human beings that are the real focal point for evolution. We humans are just bipedal, mindless meat robots who, thanks to evolution, are just designed to think everything's about us, while in reality, we're just these robots that are carrying these things that actually matter around as our pilots, these bits of information from genes to memes, and not just inside our veins, but that's right, inside our mouths. Language is a form of memes, just as religion and other cultural institutions and pastimes are, and it might be the memes which control us, at least much more than we traditionally, in our old-fashioned, positivist, Western tradition, which of course came from the Enlightenment, might be inclined to believe. This is what we call the linguistic turn in philosophy. So yes, we'll get to a lot of these things when we cover MGS5 and the philosophy of science. But already I can introduce to you that what we're talking about is the doctrine of empiricism. The idea that, as opposed to logic or pure reason, that the world is best known through empirical evidence. And what I've been trying to suggest in this video is maybe our senses, our tools for obtaining this evidence, are themselves highly faulty, flawed, and or, I guess you could say, biased. I would prefer the term human. So we can contrast this empirical idea of science with, for instance, math. According to Christopher Hitchcock in Contemporary Debates on the Philosophy of Science, quote, "It isn't entirely clear whether mathematics should be regarded as a science at all. On the one hand, mathematics is certainly not an empirical science. Mathematicians do not conduct experiments, and mathematical knowledge is not gained through observation of the natural world. But on the other hand, mathematics is undoubtedly the most precise and rigorous of all disciplines. Moreover, in some areas of science, such as theoretical physics, it's often hard to tell where the math ends and the science begins." So math would be an example of a type of reason or praxis of understanding the world that is not empirical, but is rather based on a priori maxims that logic and reason verify. In philosophy, arguments are supposed to be broken down. You're supposed to be able to break down an argument into symbolic logic. But these systems and protocols and methods that we impose on the world, I think it was the Romantic poets who had it right when they thought, back in the 19th century, that, to paraphrase Wordsworth, that we half create what we doth perceive. In other words, there's no subtracting the human element out. And really, to me, this is the biggest problem with taking a scientific mindset too far. It's just forgetting at the end of the day that we are fallible beings that don't have access to a God's eye view. And it's not at all that I'm saying we should become anti-science or anything like that. As someone who was raised in the Western tradition, I certainly believe that's the scientific method and a scientific mindset generally are the best approaches to figuring out the truth when it comes to what's really going on, things that are measurable, quantifiable, and even the not so measurable and quantifiable, which we have to contrive newer and more refined tools to measure, prod, investigate, and analyze. But at the end of the day, it's human nature that will always be with us, and that I think will always impose certain restrictions on how much truth that we can access as fallible creatures who, at the end of the day, are not half as clever as we think we are. we so-called Homo sapiens. But that's something that, again, we'll just have to wait. If you see a working model of human vocal cords and you are a paranoid, fanciful nutjob like myself, you might find yourself wondering if it does not resemble some kind of space worm. A really imaginative person might say metaphorically that this is the alien parasite. Who knows, that one day implanted in our brains and installed as our minds, using words as the program language to control us. In the Phantom Pain, Code Talker will tell us about the FOXP2 gene, which apparently humans and birds share in common and is the biological basis for our language abilities. We'll speculate more on this in a later video. But this power to control our actions and thoughts aren't the only power that words represent. There also exists another relevant possible interpretation, something called linguistic imperialism. Note, I wrote this video essay and delivered it in English. Notice that creates, whether I wanted to or not, a bar for entry to these videos, which puts a premium on the English language, like so much else in this world. As this series goes on, we will inevitably be discussing the relationships between warfare, language, and technology quite a lot. But for now, I'll only point out that teachers are second only to soldiers when it comes to the mission of civilization. Literacy. Today, it's disappearing. But there was a time when being literate was the measure of being cultured, being educated, or refined. By no means do I long for this to return, necessarily. I'm just saying that that's how it used to be. There are many problems that you could raise with the idea of a so-called Western canon, which includes some authors and creators only at the expense of others. That whole process of selecting what history remembers, Metal Gear Solid is very critical of. Educated people, it was assumed until relatively recently, would know things like the Bible or great novels almost by heart. And it was during this time, the late 19th and into the 20th century, that the measure of one's literacy was taken in terms of how well they knew the Bible. We can see this in Melville's Moby Dick, 1851, which of course was a huge influence on MGS5. But for more reasons than one. Many characters in that novel have names that readers would have recognized from the Bible in Moby Dick. Names like Elijah, Ahab, and Ishmael. Ironically, nowadays people might be more likely to recognize these names from Moby Dick or even from games like MGS5 rather than from the Bible itself. But that's the postmodern world that we're living in. That's just how things have changed in the information age. Culture has not only gone digital, it's gone secular, and gradually, culture by and large is trending towards full-blown post-literacy as its next major step. That's the next evolution in the course of human history. We've seen a huge increase in information itself in the 21st century, yet paradoxically, a concomitant huge decrease in literacy. You don't have to want to return to the age of Indian boarding schools to see this decline in literacy as a problem. Yes, even when it's English, it's a shame to see any language get eaten away, and its traditions, its ways of interpreting the world fade, become meaningless, and then get lost over time. But depending on your perspective, you can't really say that English doesn't have it coming. First, English temporarily stripped the world, arguably, of the salience of most other language traditions. Now the internet age that the Anglophone world gave rise to seems to be coming for literacy, period. We're living at a time where even the most elite universities no longer require students to read entire books. Our collective attention span has never been more shot. this has been getting worse year after year. And I'm not above it. It's all thanks to the victory of English in the Cold War. This victory the West achieved through ideas, through the spread of information, which in Ronald Reagan's famous words blew penetrating beams through the barbed wire of the Iron Curtain as easily as dust flows through lace. Reagan's almost climatological imagery hasn't aged particularly well, given it's the same information revolution that, buoyed by the petrodollar and the digitalization of Wall Street, as well as Silicon Valley's rise, has all set the stage for the rise of the unfolding climate catastrophe we are living through, as well as what seems to be a looming economic one. The AI data center and the Iran war, they may have much more immediate impact. They provide much more dramatic optics, but let's not kid ourselves. This Trump 2.0 era is just the culmination of a long-time trend. The digital age and the era of the petrodollar have been terrible for the planet and for the future from day one. We've just buried our heads in the burning sand like Saudi ostriches, or would they be Israeli? So where am I going with all this? Hopefully I've begun to properly set the stage for the scope of MGS5 as the ultimate information age video game. We're going deep into the very essence of not just petropolitics and history as such, but also language, warfare, and so-called Western society, for which many have traced back to the Ten Commandments as the foundation. And believe it or not, all of this is being foreshadowed and conveyed indirectly in this mission. After enough time passes in any society, what used to be sacred cultural rites and rituals becomes what are known as mere shibboleths, meaning mere emblems, drained of all their former power to do anything except signify, roughly, a gesture back into a shared past. Think about how people say, "bless you." They don't actually believe that you need God because you are on death's door. Or how people who aren't even believers in Christianity say, "Jesus Christ." These are shibboleths. Akin in some respects to vestigial structures in biology, things that still exist in the gene pool, purely out of tradition's sake, free riders in the evolutionary process like the appendix, wisdom teeth, and the tailbone. Even the word shibboleth comes from an old biblical story that no one really remembers, something that happened back in Israel. Having these vestigial organs have no modern day purpose, wisdom teeth, tailbone, and an appendix, but having them is just part of what it means to be fully human, to share in the same human evolutionary history as the rest of wider mankind. We don't realize it, but we are life forms who only exist thanks to the evolution over eons of time of our ancestors, many of whom looked and lived very differently than ourselves, especially the further you go back up the evolutionary tree. Words, ideas, social constructs, and practices, they've all gone through a similar evolutionary process as our bodies and minds. All information can evolve. We've just forgotten this process, as we've forgotten so much else when it comes to things like history. As you know, Angel with Broken Wings stars the character Malak. But what many don't understand is this name is yet another biblical reference. Ishmael, Ahab, Elijah, and Moloch, i.e. Malachi, are all names from the Old Testament. So let me delineate for you the significance of these names relative to the lore of MGS. Going back all the way to MGS1 with its Shadow Moses and David, aka Solid Snake, the series is full of references to stories from the Old Testament. These references typically tell you something about what's going on in the story, or at least load the language of the story of MGS with religious undertones. Snake, aka David, is named after the founder of Israel and the slayer of Goliath. When we think of Goliath, we could think of Metal Gear Rex. Big Boss goes by Ishmael in the beginning of Phantom Pain. Ishmael is a biblical character we associate with being a forsaken heir, an orphan, who still somehow manages, by the end, to lead a kingdom thanks to inheriting the powers of the bloodline of his father, the patriarch of Judaism and therefore Judeo-Christian thought, Abraham, who is also a very important figure in Islam, so in all three major branches of monotheism. Venom Snake, meanwhile, is called Ahab. Ahab is the name of a wicked king in the Book of Kings, while Quiet resembles Ahab's pagan wife, the so-called harlot Jezebel. I use the term harlot in scare quotes, of course. Jezebel, for some, in the 21st century, has become actually a symbol of feminine power, though, of course, that isn't at all what she was intended to represent by the literal patriarchy which created monotheism. Jezebel was probably a practitioner of sex magic. She's sort of like the embodiment of the ultimate other, or sinner, womanly sin, which makes her a perfect parallel to the scandalously alluring Quiet. Moses, that's another name taken from a great patriarch of monotheism. And Metal Gear Rex was designed by the DARPA chief faction within the Patriot system with the name Rex, which is Latin for king, Latin being the language of Catholicism. After all, Rex is to be a new patriarch. It was to create a new secret world order, a new religion, hence Shadow Moses. So what is the significance of Moloch? Well, the Book of Malachi is unique from the other stories in that the Book of Malachi, which as a name shares the same root word as Malak, meaning messenger or angel, is the very last book of the Old Testament. Both Malachi and Malak are variations on the same word, roughly meaning messenger, but also angel. Malachi is a messenger of God who warns about the return of God's prophet of fire, Elijah, who we last saw in the Bible going against Ahab and punishing the wicked king for his wicked ways, and punishing the harlotry of his wife, Jezebel. Malachi charges Israel of having abandoned the old ways. Exactly why Elijah was first sent to punish Ahab for forsaking the traditions, the rules of monotheism, because he changed the religion in the kingdom of Israel to match Jezebel's. She probably worshiped Baal. The particular problem, according to Malachi, in the book of Malachi, is that the latter-day Hebrews have, like Ahab once did, stopped sacrificing properly. They've started sacrificing merely sick and injured animals rather than young sacrifices full of life, which, according to God in the book of Malachi, they should know that God prefers. He doesn't want the leftovers, the sick things. He wants the young things. Basically, Judaism was rather bloodthirsty in the early days. The God of the Old Testament, famously, is a vengeful and angry one. And in the MGS universe, we can associate the Judeo-Christian concept of God, or Yahweh, with the character Zero. After all, you're not really allowed in Judaism to say God's true name. God's name is not to be uttered. So God, you could say, in this formative monotheistic religion, is himself a cipher, a major zero. The Old Testament is also where we find key related stories like the Tower of Babel and the smart virus-like plagues of Egypt in the book of Exodus. At the center of the Bible, there is God, and at the center of MGS, there is Zero. Think back to MGS3. It was an origin myth with its own version of Adam, Eve, and a snake. But it also had a god, Zero. After all, he was the one who was pulling the strings. He created us in his image. Flash forward to MGS5, Big Boss has turned away from God's will. You can think here not only of the devil, but also the famous character Jonah. So Zero sends a whale to swallow Big Boss, just like Jonah was. Zero floods his world, like Noah. Zero punishes him for Big Boss's original sin of turning away from Zero and Zero's version of the boss's will, of breaking the rules. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one. It doesn't need to be a one-to-one with the Bible and Metal Gear Solid. These names are simply loaded with meaning, especially in the context of MGS5 and its theme of literacy. You might also read the inclusion of Malak here as an Easter egg that foreshadows the appearance of Eli, who we might assume is named after Elijah, the prophet Elijah. After all, that is who Malachi tells us in the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi, will return for Israel with the same fire that he demonstrated against the evil king Ahab in the book of Kings. Elijah stood up to Ahab and proved the righteousness of the Hebrew God with a demonstration of raw firepower. We know about Liquid from later games story-wise, but earlier games release date-wise. Liquid is not unlike Elijah in the book of Malachi, because in the MGS canon, Eli 2, Liquid 2, is a famous figure we recognize from older stories in the series. In MGS 5, Eli stands up to Ahab, in a way, by the end. We have an Eli standing up to an Ahab. In this case, Venom Snake. Eli is also the one who will eventually take out Skullface, ruining his entire plan, ironically. Later, Solidus will send Ocelot to provoke Liquid into instigating the Shadow Moses incident. So basically, Liquid was created to be a weapon of God, a prophet of God. It's just that, like so many others of their weapons, Liquid will be turned against his own creators. Liquid will, though, remain a tool and a puppet until the very end, and he'll die without realizing it. It's his anger, his lust for revenge, that ultimately makes Eli, and as he grows older, Liquid Snake, into such a manipulatable pawn. And that makes the speech that he gives Solid Snake near the end of MGS1 a particular irony when he castigates his brother for forgetting his warrior's pride and allowing himself to become just another tool of the government.
What the hell are you talking about?
Following orders blindly with no questions asked, you've lost your warrior's pride and become nothing more than a pawn, Snake.
What?
Officially, Eli escaped his handlers in Africa. By the time we rescue him, Eli's operating in Africa entirely of his own free will. But that's arguably just what Eli, the little kid, has been led to believe by his puppet masters. I mean, it's a delicate thing, puppeting such a powerful asset, and we know that it will inevitably blow up in the Patriot's face on multiple occasions. But for now, in the timeline, I'd argue Eli seems to be put into Venom Snake's orbit by the Patriots on purpose. Why do I say this? Because Eli winds up being their ace in the hole, alongside Ocelot, who, like always, is likely playing all sides while keeping his true allegiances, which is to Big Boss and Big Boss's master plan of Outer Heaven, secret until the time is right. But if you want to see more about Ocelot, I did a whole video on that subject, as well as one on Liquid. So for this video, let's focus on the claim that I just made, that Eli is an unknowing Trojan horse gifted to us by the Patriots as they try and orchestrate events behind the scenes, and manage to do so by the mission Sahelanthropus, We're going to cover this in more detail later, of course, but I can already tell you that the Patriots are the ones who seem to give you the assignment for the first Africa mission, Pitch Dark, which unknowingly leads you to unpoison the river, ensuring the emergence of Eli when all the adults are killed in the village by the Kikongo strain. This in turn ensures that Diamond Dogs will inevitably contract the same strain when the children are rescued alongside Eli. Again, presumably by the Patriots' orders, through yet another cutout. This forces us, you see, to rescue Code Talker and recover him and save his research for the Patriots. And that explains how Code Talker's science in the Patriots' hands eventually, and also in the hands of brilliant younger scientists like Naomi Hunter and an older one, Dr. Clark, aka Paramedic, wind up the foundation for things like FoxDie and the SOP system. And all the nanomachines, of course. So yes, much of the Africa section, we're being led around by the nose by Cypher to get us to figure out for them what Skullface is secretly planning. By the Patriots using us in this way, it's just as Zero intended for Big Boss all along, making us a component of his military and intelligence arsenal by proxy. And notice how they feed Eli with the lust for revenge, which he'll need to overpower Skullface's lust for revenge and take over Sahelanthropus. And it's like whether we agree or not, Zero makes us do his bidding. And this is really important to keep in mind for when we actually hear Zero's voice when he comes to visit Snake in the hospital, because that scene is actually full of venom that's invisible, that you might not realize is even there. But these are two enemies meeting, you'll come to realize. And what Zero says, I don't want to spoil, but in the truth tapes, it is designed to infuriate Big Boss once he wakes up and hears it. Now, what's really intriguing is it seems that Skullface knows we are just the puppets of Cypher, even if he doesn't know about Eli. More specifically, the Patriots' wing of Cypher. So he exploits this connection by using us to hurt them. And I think this is why Skullface allows us to get Malak. Because he's empowering Diamond Dogs in a way, just like with the Honeybee. One day, you have to keep in mind, Diamond Dogs will morph into Outer Heaven, and they will oppose the Patriots. So Skullface is playing this sort of super, super long game. One way or the other. Now, if you look closely, especially in the cutscene, at the beginning of Sahelanthropus, we can infer that Zero, or rather more likely his satellite AI network, the Patriots, are watching the events of MGS5 from the sky at all times. Notice how most of the game takes place outdoors. Notice how Skullface delivers his last words to Zero while gesturing towards the sky. Of course, in beautiful MGS5 fashion, this is left slightly ambiguous. It could be Skullface's soliloquy, speaking to Zero's memory or something to that effect. If you ask me though, when he says, "Major, I'm burning up," that's directly to Zero, or whatever's left of him running the system. His will, whatever of Zero that's within those AI networks, the Patriots. Which again, we know from MGS4 are a network of satellites. And as we'll see, it's what presumably Strangelove helped build in the lab. Flashback to Mission 6, Skullface's first appearance in MGS5. He makes sure we get our hands on the Honeybee, as well as Silent Basilisk. This is why I suspect Skullface is also behind us recovering Moloch. These events, these gifts, not only put us on the trail of Skullface's true objectives, which make us more useful to Cypher, of course, as in the Patriots, which makes us more useful to Skullface as a vector to hurt them. There's also the fact that things like this mission where we recover Malak, these little steps might be leading Diamond Dogs into the future, into what we know will eventually be them pursuing their own parasite research. Meanwhile, as I sort of already touched on, weapons platforms like the Honeybee build Diamond Dogs up so that one day they will be strong enough to truly challenge Cypher. Skullface is implanting his will into the system, as he says, and all of this is very much part of that. And why can he use us as a proxy or vector to get to the Patriots? Because we serve as the Patriots' puppet. Skullface and his creations, from Sahelanthropus and the Walker Gears to the secret locking system and satellites that he created to facilitate proliferating his stealth nukes, to the vocal cord parasites he used Code Talker to weaponize. All of these things set the stage for the creation in later games, chronologically, of Patriot weapons like Foxeye and the SOP nanomachines. Of course, Metal Gears like Rex, Ray, and Arsenal Gear and the Geckos, and of course, the Patriot AI system themselves, which seem to already be in operation. Most of all, though, the most dangerous thing Skullface implants in the system seems to be two things, actually, both involving children. Note this child sacrifice theme, which was first introduced by Ground Zeroes, for what we'll discuss later in this video. The first of Skullface's child sacrifices is Chico, and to a lesser extent, debatably Paz, who, even though she's an adult by age, never really got to live an authentic childhood or pre-adulthood. So in that sense, she was sort of a child who had never really seen the outside world. The third of Skullface's child sacrifices is the living weapon, the third boy, who, as Psycho Mantis, will later in the series provide the Patriots with the mental doppelganger they will use to puppeteer the world. Mantis's powers will come to form the heart of the SOP system, and this is why in MGS4 we see the puppet strings throughout the game, if you look closely, especially in the boss fight. This indicates that people are under the control of the SOP system. These powers will come to form the heart of the SOP system, alongside Naomi's nanomachines, which will provide the foundation for the system, which in turn seem derived from Code Talker's decades of research. So it's an evolutionary tree that we can trace throughout the series. All these things Skullface contributes behind the scenes to the future that the Patriots are building. They are all what the Germans would call Atta, meaning poison. Skullface gets at the future by poisoning the seed before it can grow into the tree. But the ultimate seed that Skullface bequeaths to the future is something he doesn't even know about. It'll be the impact that Skullface will have on the development of Liquid Snake, and this is something I talked about in my video on Liquid. Liquid will learn from Skullface in ways I don't think Skullface intended or was even aware of. The Patriots create Liquid as a weapon of rage, thinking that they're so good at manipulating reality and the truth that they can keep a fire-breathing dragon like Liquid Snake under their thumb. But they inadvertently provide Liquid with the ultimate role models for rebellion, and it's unclear whether this is intentional or not. I don't think it fully is, because Liquid really does come to be a genuine thorn in the Patriot side. Who are these role models I'm talking about? First Venom Snake, then Skullface. There is also the fact that the Patriots allow Liquid to be raised, as Ocelot puts it, free range style, while David, the good son, Solid Snake, is raised in captivity in the States, so to speak. So it seems that from the beginning it's some sort of experiment into the question of nature versus nurture. Apart from it being a clone experiment, Les Enfants Terribles, which is something we're going to talk about in greater detail later, that it's also an experiment into twins, which goes back to the Nazi experiments that they did during the Holocaust. And I think it's intentional that their upbringings are different. I think it's part of the genetic experiment, testing nature versus nurture, how much the environment really affects the personality. And this is a theme in MGS5 as well as in Metal Gear Solid 1, especially when we get to Kaz and the child soldiers and his whole philosophy for raising them. The Shadow of Moses incident bears many similarities to Skullface's insurrection. So you see, the seeds are sowed for the system's destruction here, decades before Zero's system of control fully matures, and this leads to its collapse in MGS4. And when that collapse comes, it will kind of be a victory and vindication for Skullface and Paz in a weird way, beyond the grave. But what exactly is Skullface teaching Eli to oppose in Phantom Pain? In Phantom Pain's version of monotheism, roughly, you could say Zero is God, Skullface is the devil, Eli is something like the Antichrist. Keep in mind, this is all pretty loose. The devil was, in some sense, an angel with broken wings. Formerly God's most beautiful angel, or Malak, Satan was cast down into hell to become its ruler. This is mirrored in how Skullface is banished to Africa in the aftermath of Ground Zeroes, and Big Boss, whether he likes it or not, being forced to serve as poster boy for the world's military forces. Eli will eventually turn on the Patriots, using Rex to oppose them. In that act of rebellion, he will become something like the son of the devil, the son of Skullface and Big Boss combined. I should point out that in MGS, Liquid, it seems it's suggested, is somehow connected to the World Trade Center attacks. But even though I've said this before, and that is my personal opinion, what I've realized over the years is that maybe the final image we see in Kingdom of the Flies has nothing directly to do with 9/11, other than as a cheeky nod to what was our equivalent of the Manhattan incident. Maybe this image is just telling us that Liquid, in the form of his mental doppelganger Liquid Ocelot, will someday attack New York City right here along the Hudson River, lower New York Harbor. By keeping things ambiguous with a photograph, sort of like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, MGS5 is bound to keep fans and analysts arguing forever about the true significance of various ciphers such as this one. Now, speaking of ciphers, the Patriots are the systemization of Zero's will, a manifestation of his former absolute power as the invisible monarch of the world, the consolidation of that power. Traditionally, kings of England, like emperors of Japan, derived their rule from a doctrine of being somehow descended from or directly related to God himself. We can see this conceit reflected in Zero's absolute reign. Now, it's a fun coincidence that the Hebrew word for books of the Bible, like I said, is the word sefer. But again, this is distinct from cipher, which is Arabic. It just sounds similar. Kind of like the French word for Cyprus, which sounds like cipher. We're going to have to discuss word association, dream logic, and hypnosis in a later video. Ever since I've done videos on the Phantom Pain, I've sort of followed a kind of dream logic in my analysis, and I think it's irritated some people, and I understand why. I've finally figured out how to put into words why I've done this, what this is about. I finally found an avenue of research, namely hypnosis, mind control, and so-called psychic phenomena, as well as brainwashing, that I'm analyzing as a skeptic of so-called paranormal events, and more just as a researcher of this game, looking to understand it. And I find we will have to talk about this again in a later video. You will be surprised by some of the things I've found. But of course, along the way, we'll also have to talk about the topic of ghost patterns and the tendency for human minds to project phantom patterns and connections which aren't objectively there. The mind is an incredibly powerful thing. It shapes our reality in more ways than we realize, and that's really going to be the ultimate point that we're going to be driving towards with all that hocus pocus, like mind control and hypnosis and so forth. It's just about the power of the mind. There is no paranormal. There's just nature and cutting-edge technology. Now, in philosophy, the linguistic turn refers to the realization in the 20th century of the importance of language itself in structuring our sense of reality. This is mirrored in the character Zero in Metal Gear and his dreams to control the unconscious. the inside from the outside by, in part, restricting literacy, proliferating English language, and proliferating digital technology to create a unipolar dystopia. The linguistic turn is also mirrored, you might say, in the birth of the information age, which built a future around a new kind of language, namely computer language. Zero is a megalomaniac, and his computer system, the Patriots, still operates with the same Old Testament language and memes, if you will, that Zero himself used as a kind of calling card all along, going back to the events of Snake Eater. Lo, I should point out, was the first word transmitted online. Now, I'll admit this was lo as in lo and behold, a 19th century term. It doesn't directly come from the Bible, but it is sort of in biblical language. Lo comes from the Bible, particularly if you look at King James Version of the Bible. That's where lo and behold descended from. See, for instance, Matthew 24:23, lo, here is Christ. Or, in the Old Testament, Genesis 15:3, and Abraham said, behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. It's courtesy Google. Of course, lo, also, if you're a Metal Gear fan, will probably bring to mind the
Lale Lule Lo,
which is one of the names given for the Patriots. But this is the kind of ghost pattern that I mean. It's totally unnecessary whether or not Hideo Kojima even knows about this anecdote about the word lo. It just enriches his world and the language of Metal Gear Solid to know that the first word that was transmitted on the internet was lo. In the Metal Gear universe, references to the Bible will become by MGS1 an automatic principle of the system. Both humans and AI systems in Metal Gear Solid will unconsciously keep alive Zero's obsession with creating a religion out of the boss's will and her children, using the same patterns and language of monotheism as the semi-basis, with the boss serving as a kind of Jesus figure and her followers serving as sort of her disciples and messengers, her angels. That's right, the boss's sacrifice is yet another biblical image, the Christ-like figure, and the Mother Mary combined. Like Jesus, the boss was sent to die for the sins of man so that man could have a future. And just like Jesus' followers, after his death, created the Catholic Church, so too did the followers of the boss create Cypher, a new organized religion, after the age of religion. But that's why, as we'll see, Metal Gear Solid draws on all the different monotheisms for its religiosity, religious imagery, and commentary, as a postmodern masterpiece. What's interesting is that the whole notion of Jesus as a human sacrifice is just a version of what began in the early days of Judaism as the practice of child sacrifice and the practice of course, sacrificing animals, which is more widely known about. Now, there are mentions of child sacrifice in the Bible, but it's typically described as something that pagan outsiders do, like worshippers of Baal. So in other words, like Jezebel. But it turns out that the actual history of the word Moloch is much more complicated. For years, it was assumed that the Bible was accurate, that there really was a cult who sacrificed children to their god named Malak, and that certain Israelite kings participated in these atrocities, and that this was in the Old Testament given as an example of why you shouldn't follow foreign religions, basically. But according to Heath D. Durrell's Child Sacrifice in Ancient quote, modern historical scholarship has challenged the traditional understanding. Many scholars now argue that the term Moloch has been misunderstood and deny that a Moloch deity was ever worshipped in ancient Israel. On the other hand, others continued to argue in favor of the traditional interpretation and maintained that identifying Malak as some sort of deity or demon remains the most convincing explanation. Still, others argue that Moloch is in fact a deity, but that this deity is none other than Yahweh himself. The debate among scholars holding these various positions has been especially energetic over the last century. Nonetheless, nothing resembling a consensus on the matter has resulted. So this brings up an important theme, I suppose, for Phantom Pain, which is this: when you look at ancient religions, the study of ancient cultures and ancient languages, there's a lot that is left up to interpretation. It's rare for there to be absolute consensus about something that is so fraught with controversy and where the evidence is scarce. And I want you to be thinking about these limitations to human knowledge when it comes to uncovering the truth of the past and so forth, and the limits of us understanding the world as it really exists, and how we're sort of held back by our interpretations, our minds, and the interpretations they impose on the things that we find in the outside world. And it just goes to show that fiction matters more than facts, because for eons, it was just understood as a given that Moloch was this pagan deity that required human sacrifice, that required child sacrifice, by fire, I might add. And that's really the kicker, is that the Moloch sacrifices, in some cases anyway, were reportedly done with fire, which is chilling but very apt for Phantom Pain, all things considered. But it's not really, if you look closely, the meme of child sacrifice is pretty well embedded in monotheism. God told Abraham to bring Isaac to a holy place where he was told that he would be burned. And in the last minute, God decided to spare Isaac. And like many things in religion, this story is debated about what it really means and all the different ways to interpret it. But it's just one example of many in the Bible where you can see this theme or motif even, or doctrine of child sacrifice, and that to God, the philosopher Kierkegaard argued in his treatise, Fear and Trembling, that what this story represented was the idea that in the name of God, anything can be moral, basically. That to be a true believer, to truly have faith, to be a knight of faith, and all these terms that he invented, meant to embrace the idea that God defines what is and isn't moral, not human beings. And the problem with this idea is, of course, the idea that anything could be made holy, that it's essentially a doctrine of the ends justify the means, that if it's for God or for religion or for truth, that anything can be done. And that obviously we've learned in the 20th century, after World War II in particular, that the human race is capable of an unbelievable monstrousness, as we saw sacrifices in the millions, really for no reason at all, under the Third Reich. Ironically, thanks to mistranslations over eons, a phantom mirror image of the old Hebrews and their child sacrifice rites survived in the form of a fictional cult, the cult of Malak. This shows how much more fiction can matter than facts. Moloch is a name that for eons has stood for the idea of sacrificing children in some sort of bloodthirsty ritual for power. But in reality, there never was a Moloch cult. It was a Hebrew word, and it originated as a word for offering. The Hebrews didn't realize it, but they were the worshippers of Moloch, or had been. They were just scared of their own shadow, their own dark mirror. We know this by simply considering the Jesus myth itself, which again is just another example of child sacrifice. God sent his own son to die, we're told, in a ritual that would wipe the slate clean of human sin. This echoes, of course, how God led Abraham. These biblical examples demonstrate how even if we repressed it from our conscious minds, the meme, if you will, the practice of ritual sacrifice, particularly ritual child sacrifice, has never really left culture. If you think about the child soldiers in Phantom Pain, up to and including Eli and the third boy, you'll realize that a form of child sacrifice is lurking in the margins everywhere in MGS5. Ocelot will even say as much when describing the third boy's origins. And when you think about it, child sacrifices have been a part of Metal Gear Solid going back to MGS1. I mean, even Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, there's a whole scene, of course, where Big Boss talks about how he'll raise the children that he's harvested from the battlefield into they'll be the seeds of war that he'll plant to create his warrior utopia. So, and then of course Liquid talking about the other clones that were sacrificed. Then you think about how Frank Yeager couldn't bring himself to kill Naomi when she was a child, so he adopted her. But the implication, other than that Frank Yeager, that certainly wasn't the only kid. Naomi's life was ruined because she was a war orphan. In MGS2, you have the child soldiers theme. In MGS3, you see so many characters raised since childhood to be pawns of the philosophers. And on and on and on it goes. The Beauty and the Beast unit, these are all just sort of the tip of the iceberg. MGS5 will eventually show us in Africa an industrialized form of child sacrifice in the human trafficking, modern day slavery, and Holocaust-like experimentation that we see there in children and young adults, as well as other innocent victims in the Patriots' nightmarish system that they built in Africa under Skullface's influence. So hopefully I've begun to explain how words shape the stories that we tell ourselves, our thoughts, our patterns.
But you see how rumors and ideas about people can get out of hand fast. Once you create a character and put it out there in public mind, it warps and twists with every baseless rumor. And before you know it, all people see are phantoms.
But on a lore level, all this points to the insidious influence of Zero and his memes, as well as the dynastic schemes of he himself and all of his sons and daughters and proxies, so to speak. Martyrdom and sacrifice will come to define the times in the 21st century. In the 21st century, as always, ours is a society that murders the innocent. A child sacrifice theme is particularly interesting for the Phantom Pain, considering its myriad connections to movies like The Shining and historical events like the Holocaust, slavery, or 9/11. Anytime the innocent is sacrificed in the name of power, you can think not just of MGS5, you can think of Moloch. Malak with Angel. And how they both descended from the same monotheistic tradition. Angels and demons, heroes and madmen. One monotheism and another, fact and fiction. Not a lot of real differences between these extremes. At least that's one interpretation. MGS5 treats the tragedy of power, you might call it, as a universal human tendency. Parasitizing of sacrifices in the name of power is a basic flaw in our makeup in Metal Gear that Skullface, with his master plan, wants to fix. Even though MGS5 does focus a lot on ancient tales, ancient cultures, it would be a mistake to overemphasize the focus on the Old Testament. I would argue that the topic not only of Judaism but of anti-Semitism is inherently being mentioned and, of course, criticized in Phantom Pain, because if we look at Skullface's origins, it's almost certain that he grew up in one of the most anti-Semitic places and times in recent memory, which is World War II era Romania / Hungary. And if you think this is crazy, consider this. Again, going with the literacy theme, the name of the song from Phantom Pain is what? Like the song that plays in the game. Sins of the Father. This phrase is from Shakespeare, and it is from his extremely anti-Semitic play, The Merchant of Venice. The sins of the father in this play refers to the sin, supposedly, of killing Jesus. Yes, that's right, for many, many, many eons, Christians, once they became a distinct religion from Judaism, turned on their former brothers and sisters. And even though the whole point of Jesus was that he was sent for all of humankind, they placed the blame of Jesus' death not on the Romans who carried out his execution, but on the who the Romans in the Bible exploit. It's a populist move, the death of Jesus in the Bible. It's to appease the crowd. And yes, because Jesus of Nazareth was calling himself the Son of God and doing many things that were against Judaism, there were, according to the story, who wanted to see him crucified. But this has been a fountainhead for anti-Semitism, and it's absolutely ludicrous. Because remember, folks, Jesus was Jewish. Anti-Semitism is itself a kind of virus, just like other forms of discrimination, that's been passed down for a long time, unfortunately. There's good and bad people in any group. Every different kind of human being has something to offer. And every kind of human being has had to deal with the same flaws of human nature, which is not unique to any one group, but shared by all of us. Is this part of us that leads us to war? Is this part of us that causes our different ideologies, our different religions, different cultures to come into conflict? Lurking in the background, of course, is the theme, though, of liberty and how these blood feuds that last generations between groups or races or tribes, how they deprive individuals in that group of any freedom of their own to decide how to live their lives. I, for instance, am related to a very horrible person from history, Robert E. Lee. Does that mean that before I was even born, that I'm condemned by the sins of my ancestor? Maybe to a degree. But just as I think that I deserve a chance, I think everybody else deserves a chance, regardless of what group they come from, or what the history is of this or that tribe. Because if you go back far enough, we're all human beings, and everybody has dirt, everybody has something compromising as a group. So if you blame each other as groups and look at each other as groups, it never ends. It just goes on and on and on. If you're a humanist, you believe in individuals. But unfortunately, there are adherents to racist ideologies even to this day. Perhaps it's our connection with the past through technology that makes it so difficult to rid our collective unconscious of these parasites. These ideals, these words. But there is one person that you could scapegoat for a lot of today's problems involving Israel. That person was because of the Holocaust that the Israelis are so dead set on avoiding another one, and you can't really blame them for that. Obviously, the situation is very complicated, but I'm just saying the Israelis inherited a bad situation, and they're not necessarily free to decide for themselves how they would best like to live in the region. While it's easy and probably important on some level to criticize some of the actions of Israel, I think if we look at the history of this country, we'll see that it is a huge mess that the people who actually live there, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, inherited from the imperialist powers who had the bright idea to create this problem in the first place. Phantom Pain almost seems to suggest that dividing and conquering the world into these different groups, these nation states and these ideas of nations, is one of the ways that the English-led status quo is carried on. Who can say? But yes, tragically, as I've already said, according to some, according to me as well, what is going on in the is approaching, at the very least, something on the scale that has not been seen since 1940s Germany and Eastern Europe. And it's tragic to see this cycle play out. So many millions of lives trapped in this spiral of causality. A riptide. It's very Old Testament in a way. Because in the Old Testament, yes, the sins of the father are, in Exodus, for instance, well, I can't get into all that, but I'll just say it's a very ancient world way of looking at things. But unfortunately, it's still with us. I'm not going to talk that much about this in this video, but suffice to say, yes, pretty much every taboo subject in the book is addressed by Phantom Pain in some form or another, and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are both in there. So that's why it would be a terrible shame if anyone took away from this video that I'm saying that Phantom Pain or this channel is in any way anti-Semitic. I've done many videos talking about the richness and the greatness of Judaism, actually. So I personally, just for the record, don't support BB. I know this is an extremely fraught subject, but I resist, and I would ask for my viewers to resist making any kind of hasty generalizations, especially since we're talking about a handful of bad actors who have a lot of power in society, and the rest of the people there don't necessarily have a lot of say. And then on top of that, the Israelis and Jewish people around the world are sort of two different groups, and this is a very contentious issue, so that's why we can't talk much about it further. But yes, I think it's very important to make sure, especially if we're going to criticize things that doing, like I do sometimes, that we also make sure not to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater and open the door for Nazis and anti-Semites to come rushing in. Phantom Pain is saying that we are all one. There's really just human nature, and that it's conveyed or expressed in lots of different shades, and that every different shade brings something of value to the table. That no group or interpretation or little pocket of human existence should be wiped out. That's why the game is so concerned with the much softer type of extinction that is perhaps more common than an outright genocide, which is the extinction of languages, language groups, and so forth. Did you know that Hebrew was actually once extinct and was brought back to life in the late 19th century? It's actually the only language that's ever done that. But Semitic actually refers to Arabic and Hebrew, as well as a few other languages. Isn't that interesting? While taboo, the ancient Hebrews were hardly alone in their sacrifices. Many Molochs, many sacrifices, many Malaks, many angels have been sent to heaven for the operation of one society or another. For eons, India ran on a strict caste system, which literally built an entire society on the backs of the unfree. Consider how the mighty sperm whale, probably the most intelligent being on planet Earth, was sacrificed on the altar of global American energy for the rise of America as a superpower. Take your pick for examples of sacrifices for power. There's slavery, communism, colonialism, apartheid, Jim Crow, which is making a comeback in 2026, it so happens. And yes, again, the Holocaust. Tragically, something similar to that is playing out in the world. The victims, it seems, of one atrocity have become the perpetrators of another in an endless cycle of violence and revenge, the very definition of tragedy. The examples of almost ritualistic sacrifices of being needed, or at the very least being used to control civilizations and brainwash the masses, goes back a long time. Even if the salience of such archaic practices has long since died out, at least consciously, it may have, like so much else, just evolved and become more subtle. So yes, this tendency to sacrifice the innocent in the name of power is something that seems to have died out. If you think about modern day compared to the blatantness of yesteryear, think about the ancient Aztecs sacrificing someone every day, thinking they had to do that to get the sun to come up. Barbaric, so-called uncivilized practices like that, those things are seen as backwater. And if they happen today in a blatant way, they're seen as indicative of a backwards culture. But even in the most advanced cultures, these practices go on. The Imperial Japanese during World War II, like the samurai before them, valorized martyrdom, self-sacrifice. And this grew into something really horrible, the kamikaze strikes. This is mirrored in certain religious extremist groups of today. The idea that you should die for your country isn't that commonly known as patriotism. We see that playing out today. Surely, if you ask the rulers of Iran or America, they would say absolutely that's what patriotism is, because they need those bodies. They need those sacrifices. Or maybe patriotism is that bloodless feeling of justice that you can catch like a high or maybe a fever from a proper 90s or early 2000s military propaganda game. Everything but the glory and the righteousness is digitally muted, blurred, behind this virtual reality. It's a form of mind control. And mind control, it turns out, is essentially as old as human beings. As old as shamans, as old as hypnosis and dream interpretation. Scrying the bones of birds, using technology to fight wars, these things are part of human nature. And they've been evolving in some form all along. But that nature is being debased more and more, rendered ugly, almost unrecognizable, barbaric, by a preponderance and concentration of power in the American system. But there has to be a balance between customs, between cultures. I think that's the idea of Metal Gear Solid. Keep in mind, not all weapons are physical. Uniting people around a single will is inevitably some form of violence, some form of brainwashing. Words can kill. War plays out like a play on the stage of the world, and we are merely its players. We allow the powerful, through the words they teach us, to lay their eggs inside our minds. In exchange for the convenience they offer, we gladly sell our souls as well as our minds. How many great wars can't officially begin before a great number of innocents first have to die as a justification? Tell me again how the Spanish-American War, the Pacific War, the Vietnam War, the War on Terror, how is it all these American wars started? Tell me, how is it that they started the same way? With dubious stories designed to redirect a people's vengeance and grief onto convenient targets of questionable culpability. The Gulf of Tonkin, Cuba, Pearl Harbor, the World Trade Center, you get the picture. It's the same story with minor variations, over and over again, in a branching evolutionary path that we can trace all back throughout American history. Even the American Revolution did not begin in earnest until the deaths, the sacrifices at Lexington and Concord, the so-called shots heard around the world. Some form of this exploitation of deaths, of murder, of ruin, tragedy, and sacrifice have existed going back into our atavistic primitive past, probably since the very dawn of man. And it's no stranger to every race, color, and creed. We're all basically the same, as MGS5 shows us, whether east or west. Power is usually obtained at the expense of the innocent, with the exploitation of the less powerful. The victims of geopolitical conflict are usually civilians, The state and non-state actors who kill human beings in the name of their cause, whatever that cause is, they tend to believe that the ends justify the means, or at least their rulers and masterminds do. This is the definition of a Malachian bargain, a phrase Nietzsche himself was fond of using. Nietzsche's whole point was that we should decide for ourselves how best to live. We have to figure that out. For ourselves, because it's something for us. So no one else can tell us what to think, or set our path for us. But how can we be free if we are powerlessly told what to think, as literacy is gradually worn away to nothing? This is a major theme of the entire MGS saga, namely the question of liberty. How can we be truly free if someone or something else is doing the thinking for us? What is the difference without free will between submission and rebellion? Where is the freedom in this patriotism? It's usually people outside the party, so to speak, who typically are the ones who are sacrificed, who have to die for our puppet masters' truth, their interpretations, their versions of liberty. It's a cruel world, boss, and it rarely changes. A cruel angel's thesis. And the more that interpretation itself is curtailed and literacy suppressed, the more we outsource our thinking, the more we become dependent on a version of the world that is mediated digitally as we ride waves of influence, outsource our thinking to shorts, Snapchat, AI prompts, as we learn simply to skim read rather than take the time to close read and form a nuanced opinion. What I'm describing here is also a war in our minds, a war for control. And the Epstein class, the rulers in Washington, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley, these neo-imperial robber barons, they are the enemy, and they are winning. It's all this, for all its horrific flaws, that Skullface is quite right to oppose. It's just that ironically, in the end, Skullface just becomes another example of the same tragedy of power, consumed by the mind virus of Machiavellian ethics that states for those in power, the ends always justify the means. It's impossible for Skullface to have the moral high ground when he sacrifices and tortures children. But you know what they say, I guess he has the idea, you can't beat him, join him. He's just a more nakedly brutal version in some ways of the same horrendous tragedy of power. Speaking of ends, that does it for this episode, boss. Next time, we'll finally get to Huey and the events of Hellbound. After that, the first few quiet tapes, and the first few Huey interrogation tapes too. Until next time, boss.